Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Jamie Gass, the Director of Pioneer Education. I hope everyone is safe and healthy. Welcome to the webinar launch of our new book, Restoring the City on a Hill, U.S. History and Civics in America's Schools. In company with Sallust, Cicero, Tacitus, and Livy, you will learn wisdom and virtue. You will see them represented with all the charms which language and imagination can exhibit, and vice and folly painted in all their deformity and horror. You will ever remember that all the end of study is to make you a good man and a useful citizen. This will ever be the sum total of the advice of your affectionate father. This is from John Adams's May 1781 letter to his 14-year-old son, John Quincy Adams. Until the 21st century, they were the only father-son team to both serve as U.S. president and two of the great public service the country has ever produced. The vital connections between these eminent figures in American history were, of course, their indomitable wife and mother, Abigail Adams, and a shared love for the hard-won lessons about civic learning drawn from the celebrated historians of ancient Rome. The news stories we witness daily and our struggling civic culture are no doubt troubling to us all. These days, many look around and ask, the founders sacrificed their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to secure for us the blessings of liberty. So why do we too often trivialize, ignore, or entrust our public institutions to such incompetence and treachery? In our, frustration, it's worth remembering, though, it was said of the founding era's great anti-hero, Aaron Burr, that his only claim to virtue was that he never claimed to have any. That is, history teaches us to calm ourselves because none of this is really new. Human nature being what it is and always will be, these are the same concerns that civic-minded people of conscience have had across the ages, amidst revolutions, wars, injustice, and tyranny. The advice John Adams gave to John Quincy no doubt seems esoteric and remote from our world of the internet, cell phones, texting, and artificial intelligence. But not only was the America of 1781 much more dangerous than ours is, it was also far less certain that our young republic would even survive. John Adams knew far better than most how precarious the American cause was and how long the odds were. Consider this, the probability of a collection of ragtag colonial farmers successfully breaking free from the British Empire, the most powerful military and naval force on the planet, would not likely impress Vegas odds makers. And yet, John Adams's main advice to his young son was to study ancient history. Why? Because he knew that the history of the Roman Empire helped ground students with a firm understanding of human nature, how republics rise and fall, and how well-educated and principled civic-minded leaders can change the world. It's with this faith in reason and human intelligence that Pioneer has released our new book on teaching U.S. history and civics in America's schools. As co-editor Chris Sinicola will discuss shortly, Pioneer's book reflects well over a decade of work on U.S. history and civics. In the process, we've tried to highlight and uphold the best principles of America's founding ideals, while looking unflinchingly at all the horrors when our country has failed to live up to those high ideals. This effort has included working with many outstanding teachers, running student history essay contests, countless research papers, op-eds, and polls, as well as numerous events and podcasts with Pulitzer winners covering every major phase of American history. Our students deserve no less than our best. The framers knew their experiment in ordered liberty rested upon a citizenry that was well educated in the basics of civics, government, and a respect for constitutionalism. It's why we believe that supporting and honoring civic educators who do this work every day will be central to the success of that experiment. Many superb teachers and educators, including some with us today, continue to keep K-12 civic education and the study of history alive in our classrooms. Excellent programs like We the People, The Citizen and the Constitution, and states that have solid academic content standards can help lead the way. The advice of John Adams and his fellow framers was that civic education based on history, virtue, and learning to uphold democratic principles should be the central focus of K-12 education. Our lawmakers, education policymakers, school leaders, and citizens alike need to recommit to this vision of educating for democracy and learning in liberty. Consequently, we're happy to host and present our terrific panelists today, who are among the most thoughtful educators, researchers, practitioners in the area of academic quality and civic education. With us this afternoon, we have Chris Sinicola, Director of Communications and Media Relations at Pioneer Institute and co-editor of Restoring the City on a Hill, U.S. History and Civics in America's Schools. Ian Rowe, founder and CEO of Vertex Partnership Academies in New York City and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Mariam Memorsadeghi, founder and director of the Cyrus Forum, which works to aid a peaceful and durable transition to democracy in Iran. Kelly Brown, a social studies and government teacher at East Hampton High School, former Massachusetts Teacher of the Year, and the driving force behind the We the People Contest 2020 National Civics Champions. Alicia Thomas Searcy, the 2022 Democratic nominee for Georgia State School Superintendent and a former six-term state legislator in Georgia. Roger DeRochers, a retired social studies teacher at Millbury High School and the president of the Massachusetts Center for Civic Education. And finally, Emily Voss, Senior Manager of National Programs and Professional Development Center at the Center for Civic Education. We're pleased to begin with Chris Sinicola.
Thank you, Jamie. So our new book, which is out, here it is in living color, too reflective there, Restoring the City on a Hill, U.S. History and Civics in America's Schools, really begins with two big pieces of advice, the first of which comes from Bill Weld and the late Tom Birmingham. And it's really timeless. And they say very simply in their foreword, don't ignore history. Now, specifically in the context of Massachusetts, they meant that Massachusetts ought to fulfill the letter of the 1993 Massachusetts Education Reform Act and make passage of a U.S. history test a requirement for graduation from any public high school in Massachusetts. More generally, however, what they're talking about in that foreword is they're pointing to the vitally important role that knowledge of history plays in shaping an informed citizenry and electorate. They cite the words of educational standards experts such as E.D. Hirsch Jr., who said, and he's quoted in the book to this effect, the aim of schooling was not just to Americanize the immigrants, but also to Americanize the Americans. And that's something that really came home to us recently at Pioneer when we commissioned a poll by Emerson Polling that showed Massachusetts residents getting only 63% on average of questions correct drawn from the citizenship test. So a bit of concern there. So looking about us today, it's remarkable really how much we've lost. Polls such as that poll are one example. Standardized test scores, which seem to be in decline on just about every measure. And the polarization and infighting that we see both in the national capital and sometimes in state capitals, and I'm sure most folks watching this today have experienced that to some degree. These are all measures of how we've lost sight of some of the lessons that history has to offer us. The second piece of advice that the book leads off with is a far more positive phrasing, if you will. It comes from Paul Reed, who writes the introduction to the book, and he focuses on the life and work of Winston Churchill. Paul was chosen, of course, as the biographer to finish the life of Churchill, which William Manchester had begun. And he did a remarkable job. And in that introduction, he urges us to follow the example that Churchill set and be students of history. Now, to be sure, you don't need to write as much history as Winston Churchill did, thankfully. Never mind make history in the many ways that he did, from his military exploits during the Boer War to his leadership of England through the Second World War, even winning the Nobel Prize for Literature for his remarkable output. But there really is no substitute or excuse, in my view, for not reading history, for not knowing how your nation, your state, and your community have been shaped. And Churchill illustrates for us through brilliant prose many of the lessons of history. As long as we're willing to open our eyes and read, we can understand and learn from the past and perhaps avoid some of the mistakes that were made by those who came before us. Now, some folks will ask, why another book about history? Isn't history just something happened? It happened this way. It's fixed for all time. Of course, we all know that's not how history works, right? Unlike mathematics or the hard sciences, where laws, once they've been uncovered, tend not to change very much, historians find employment precisely because the historical record is subject to reinterpretation. Our understanding of the past is constantly being refined and reshaped in the light of new information from fields such as archaeology, anthropology, linguistics. New discoveries in art, science, and culture help historians better understand the artifacts that crowd the historical record, make sense of them, and represent them to modern readers in new ways that build new understanding. That doesn't mean, of course, that every interpretation of history that's out there is correct or accurate. It certainly doesn't mean that every interpretation that comes along is worthy of inclusion in a K-12 curriculum. You have to make choices. There's a lot of information on offer. So the first task that we undertook with this book was to look back over the last 10 years or so at white papers that we had produced at Pioneer, to sort through those, boil them down to their essence, and try to tell a story about where we've been, where we are, and where we hope to go with civics and history instruction. That question is just as important as understanding history itself, to ask and answer the question, where have we been? And in doing so, we hope to understand some of the missteps we've made and how we can improve. Now, landmark works of American history, such as David Hackett Fisher's book, Albion's Seed, which I recently had the pleasure of reading. It's 900 pages. It took a while. And Shelby Foote's trilogy on the American Civil War. Other examples, Ron Chernow's remarkable biographies, his lives of Washington and Alexander Hamilton, take you well beyond, you know that Washington was our first president, father of the country. Hamilton's on the $10 bill. Well, there's a lot more to the story, obviously. And these works will develop for students and for adult learners a remarkably rich and deep baseline knowledge of American history. And that's great. And it's also not enough, because we all know that history doesn't end, and historians are in the business of taking new information, those new discoveries I talked about earlier, and representing those, reinterpreting those in ways that help today's students understand the context and apply that knowledge of history to new circumstances as they arise. So the question becomes, where do we stand today? Well, Restoring the City on a Hill tackles that question head on in Chapter 8, where we look at and offer a report card on 15 of the most widely used and popular history and US civics curricula out there. We just go right through, just as you would see a report card today, or you may have in the past, receive those report cards, you pull them out with great trepidation and ask, oh my gosh, how did I do in this class? So one of the purposes of the book, and really one of the purposes of Pioneer, is to offer the public an honest, independent, and unvarnished assessment of what is on offer in the marketplace of ideas in several areas, and notably in education, where we do a lot of our work. Now, there will always be disagreement as to those grades or assessments, and that's fine. After all, there is some subjectivity involved and some judgment. And I think I should add that even those curricula that we find wanting for various reasons that are explained in the book have a purpose. I mean, every curriculum out there, every work of history that is produced and written is remarkable in a sense, because when you go there and look at the bookshelves at your local bookseller, I'm always impressed by the amount of work that goes into these works. Whether I agree or not is another matter, but it really is amazing. And even those works with which you ultimately disagree serve a purpose of helping challenge your assumptions, helping to strengthen and refine your arguments by forcing you to do the hard work that historians do every day. So the third, and I think perhaps the most important thing that our book tries to do, is to show the path forward. It's great to say, okay, here's where we've been, and here's where we think some of the curricula are going, and some are better than others, but we want to offer some positive suggestions and recommendations for the future. So in addition to releasing this book, Pioneer over the coming year is undertaking a parallel effort that we call the American Citizenship Project, that focuses on a number of things, including principles of federalism and so forth. So much more to come on those topics. But our goal with that primarily is to offer a comprehensive K-12 history and civics curriculum that would be of use to any kind of school, any kind of educator, private schools and homeschools included, provided They seek a deep understanding of the nation's history and share with Pioneer a basic understanding that America is a fundamentally good nation, that for all the problems that we've had and all the times we failed to live up to the ideals that we set for ourselves, folks are still coming to this country from all over the world every year, seeking to be part of that American experiment in democracy that's been ongoing for so long. Now, we recognize at Pioneer that no one curriculum is going to meet everyone's needs. That's probably not possible in a nation that is as large, diverse, and contentious as the United States is. But we do hope that Americans can re-engage in civil discourse about our past. We don't think it's too much to hope that we agree on a few basic things. Education matters. It matters for everyone, everywhere. History matters. And that knowing our history, with all its imperfections, is the only way that we can prepare people to be active participants, fully informed in civic life. So this modest volume that we're launching today aims only really to help guide those who are interested in the teaching of history toward that more civil and productive conversation, one in which we want all voices to be heard. You might say it's our modest contribution to canceling cancel culture. But to be sure, that civil dialogue grounded in mutual respect is not the way or the only way the debate over US history might play out. It is not the only way it has played out, unfortunately, in recent years. But we think it is the best way to achieve that more perfect union that the founders talked about and that the American people have sought for nearly 250 years. So I would now like to invite Ian Rowe to deliver our keynote address. Ian.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this launch. I thought I'd start with a story. On September 12th, 1962, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at the request of the New York Civil War Commission at the centennial celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation. In his remarks, King emphasized that the document that started the long process of ridding America of slavery was actually inspired by the core principle of equality embedded in the country's founding document. This is what King said. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed to a world then organized politically and spiritually around the concept of the inequality of man, that the dignity of human personality was instead inherent in man as a living being. The Emancipation Proclamation was the offspring of the Declaration of Independence. It was a constructive use of the force of law to uproot a social order which sought to separate liberty from a segment of humanity. What King so eloquently revealed was that slavery, far from being a particular American atrocity, was an accepted, grotesque feature at the center of a world ordered around the normalcy of human bondage. Yet it was America's Enlightenment principles that allowed it to, in King's words, uproot a social order and liberate millions of enslaved people in recognition of their inherent and individual human dignity. I share these words of Martin Luther King on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation because it serves as a good example of how the teaching of African American history is one and the same with the teaching of American history. The two are intertwined. King's words also demonstrate how the full telling of American history, the acquisition of historical knowledge that shows how our founding principles drove human progress and expanded freedom, can cultivate within our rising generation a civic pride and ultimately civic virtue. According to the National Constitution Center, civic virtue describes the character of a good participant in a system of self-government. The personal qualities associated with the effective functioning of the civil and political order or the preservation of its values and principles. This is relevant to my story because between 2010 and 2020, I was the CEO of a nonprofit network of public charter and elementary schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Our faculty had the solemn responsibility to educate more than 2,000 students, primarily low-income Black and Hispanic kids, whose parents chose our schools because they wanted their children to develop the skills and habits to become agents of their own uplift and to build a better life. And each year we had maybe 200 to 300 open seats, but we had nearly 5,000 families on our wait list, all eager for the opportunity for their child to live the American dream. In District 12 in the Bronx, only 7% of the nearly 2,000 public students in traditional district schools beginning ninth grade in 2015 graduated ready for college 4 years later. That means a shocking 93% of students either dropped out of high school before completing their senior year, or if they did manage to graduate and earn a high school diploma, they were still required to take remedial catch-up classes in community college due to low math and reading scores on state exams. Many of our parents may have faced discrimination and other challenges in their own lives, and sometimes they feared that their children might as well. But they know that a great education can make a huge difference. They know that because of America's legacy of resilience in the face of slavery and discrimination and other challenges, hundreds of doors are now open. And young people of all races have the ability to open those doors if they're prepared to capitalize on the opportunities at their fingertips. If we truly care about restoring the city on a hill, about increasing upward mobility and creating a community marked by civic virtue, we must be wary of the kinds of barriers and the meta-narratives that, in my experience, are impeding the ability of young people to shape a positive sense of possibility and their belief as to whether or not they can achieve the American dream. These two meta-narratives I call blame the system, and the other is blame the victim. In a blame the system narrative, if you're not successful in our country, the reason you aren't achieving the American dream is that America itself is the problem. According to this belief system, the country was founded on a lie. It was founded as a slaveocracy, not a democracy. The founding principles were false when they were written, that based on immutable characteristics like race or sex, America is an oppressive nation, that these systems are so rigged, so discriminatory, that the individual is powerless, and that only massive government intervention is the solution. By contrast, in the blame the victim narrative, if you're not successful, America is not the problem, you are the problem. In this conception, America is full of opportunity, and that if you are not successful, then you are the cause of your own failure. You have some pathology. You should have pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps. In the absence of solid civic knowledge or a sense of history defining what is possible, it would be easy for a young person absorbing these two meta-narratives to assume that odds are stacked against you. In my home state of New York, in June of 2010, the New York State Regents approved the elimination of social studies exams at the 5th and 8th grade levels. Since that time, it's been extraordinary to look at the typical elementary school curriculum and how time is now allocated during the school day. What used to be a solid 5 days per week, 60 minutes per class, focused on social studies and American history, has now devolved into typically social studies, maybe 2 days per week, and often 1 day per week for 45 minutes. That time has been replaced with typically content agnostic curriculum focused on reading skills, not a deliberate effort to create a cumulative, coherent body of knowledge. E.D. Hirsch often writes about. It's very hard for young people to cultivate civic virtue if we're not providing enough opportunities for students to build civic knowledge of our country and an understanding of all of our trials and tribulations. So between blame the system and blame the victim, I know how debilitating such narratives can be for a student's hopes and aspirations if you are repeatedly told that there's nothing you can do individually to achieve the American dream because the system is rigged against you, or that it's your fault for failing to do so. Rather than helping young people develop an understanding of the behaviors most likely to propel them into success, this message will only teach what psychologists term learned helplessness. If we want to restore the city on a hill, we must envision an empowering alternative, a counter to the debilitating blame the victim and blame the system meta-narratives. That empowering alternative, in my view, is agency as the pathway to cultivate civic virtue. I define agency as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. Think of agency like a vector or velocity, where velocity is not just speed, it's speed and direction. So if agency is free will plus moral discernment, where does that moral guidance come from? No one is entirely helpless and no one can truly make it on their own. Agency is individually practiced, but socially empowered. In my book, Agency, I propose a new framework, FREE, based on encouraging young people to embrace 4 pillars: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. A revitalization of the 4 local mediating institutions that drive human flourishing. But for this talk, I want to focus within the education framework, because I think it's very important that we build new institutions that model what we aim to accomplish. This means teaching the rising generation a full history of this country, warts and all. It means letting them know that they live in a good, if not great, country, one that is not hostile to their dreams. With that in mind, I have now launched Vertex Partnership Academies, a public charter high school in District 12 in the Bronx, which seeks to develop virtuous high school graduates who have acquired the habits, knowledge, and sense of personal agency necessary to lead self-determined, purposeful lives of American and global citizenship. Students at Vertex Partnership Academies will learn a core and lasting body of knowledge, which includes the basic principles of constitutional government, mathematics, science, language skills in Spanish and Mandarin, important events in world and US history, and the classical, acknowledged masterpieces of art, music, theater, poetry, and literature. Vertex Partnership Academies is organized around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom, both as an expectation for each student and faculty member in our community to personally adopt. I'm at Vertex right now, so those are our class bells. So both as an expectation for each student and faculty member in our community to personally adopt, and as a conceptual framework that shapes every aspect of school culture, policies, canon, and curriculum. Courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom are called cardinal virtues from the Latin cardo, which means hinge, because they are the root virtues upon which all other standards of moral excellence depend. Each cardinal virtue is an intrinsic life habit that we are seeking to cultivate within each student. When normed and practiced regularly, these individual behaviors then form the collective basis of a good society, a community that is self-governed by public virtue. Now, for each cardinal virtue, there is an I statement. And we require students to memorize these I statements as part of the process for how we want young people to internalize their sense of personal responsibility and agency. So let me read to you our 4 I statements. Courage. I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of uncertainty and struggle. Justice. I uphold our common humanity and honor the inherent dignity of each individual. Temperance. I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and my behavior. And finally, wisdom. I make sound judgments based on knowledge of objective, universal truth. If we want to build a self-governing free society, then we need to cultivate individuals that have the ability to self-govern themselves. The idea is that our students will learn these virtue definitions first in their head and ultimately in their hearts to manage their own attitudes and behavior. Now, more broadly, as educators debate how best to teach K-12 students about civics and American history today, it's important to emphasize as uncommon America's post-abolition march toward becoming a multi-ethnic society with an unprecedented combination of size, peacefulness, and prosperity. It is now accepted that America's founders laid out inspiring ideals around life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, but also committed the original sin of not allowing all human beings the right to fully live up to those same ideals. Yet, despite that inherent contradiction, America has made steady progress dismantling those laws and practices that slowed our path to form a more perfect union. Our challenge is to be honest about those laws and practices while also celebrating how our nation's enduring principles have provided the world an indispensable model of how formerly enslaved people and other marginalized groups from around the globe came to regularly produce some of the country's most influential leaders in virtually every facet of American life. As King said on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, "If our nation had done nothing more in its whole history than to create just 2 documents, its contribution to civilization would be imperishable. The first of these documents is the Declaration of Independence, and the other is that which we are here to honor tonight, the Emancipation Proclamation. All tyrants, past, present, and future, are powerless to bury the truths in these declarations, no matter how extensive their legions, no matter how vast their power, no matter how malignant their evil," end quote. There it is. A hopeful and upwardly mobile future for Americans of all races must be built on a shared understanding of our past that is accurate and expansive, not falsely embellished nor narrowly selective. Those who seek to teach a sanitized version of American history to achieve some false sense of patriotic education do our country and our students a disservice. And ironically, so do those who cherry pick the most egregiously cruel acts to weave together a narrative of a permanent American malignancy. It is through exposing all the truths of these declarations, as King said, that we can best build civic knowledge in K-12 schools, and as a dividend, perhaps we will also inspire a reverence for liberty and the American experiment. Let me close by quoting from de Tocqueville's America, who said, quote, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults," end quote. I've always loved that quote because it emphasizes the idea that America has within it the tools for self-renewal and self-betterment. In the same way, I want young people, my students, to know that they have within themselves the tools of self-renewal and self-betterment, and that part of their civic duty is to work towards the betterment of themselves and their country. Thank you very much. And with that, I would love to pass the baton to Miriam.
Thank you so much, Ian Rowe. What an inspiration to hear your words today. I took a lot of notes. What an honor to hear your perspective on what makes America so great, particularly as someone who comes from a country that is suffering from totalitarianism. Your reminder for what makes America good, if not great, as you say, was very poignant to me. The Tocqueville quote in particular about how we are constantly repairing ourselves and able to do so. I look forward now to welcoming our distinguished panel. If you could please, yes, wonderful. Okay. So we have some really good questions for all of you, and we are going to begin with Kelly Brown, round one of our questions. You're a superb teacher who has been teaching civics, history, and social studies for many years, while leading your students to several state and even national championships in high school civics. Could you talk about what it has meant to your teaching when you started using the higher academic quality We the People curriculum, as well as how it specifically changed your classroom instruction?
Sure, I would love to. And thank you so much for having me here today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the We the People curriculum, this is a curriculum that is put out by the Center for Civic Education, and it is a comprehensive study of the Constitution from the philosophical underpinnings through to modern application. And so the students actually engage in a very rigorous academic study of the Constitution, but something that makes it unique is that it involves an authentic assessment for students where they have the opportunity to dig deeply in each of the units into certain questions and to develop an answer to those questions and present it as a small team in front of scholars and judges. And so in my classroom, every unit, we have the opportunity at the end of the unit, instead of just taking a test, which we do some quizzes and tests, students actually have to testify about certain aspects of what they've been studying with adults that they generally don't know. And they have the opportunity to present what they know and answer questions about it. And when I started teaching this program about 10 years ago, and it absolutely transformed everything I do in the classroom. I wish, and I try very hard to reproduce it with all the other things that I teach at the high school level. And it changed my life. It changed the students' lives. It changed our school and our community's lives, really, in terms of looking at the importance of the Constitution, in terms of looking at the importance of civic engagement. And just to touch on a couple of things, I think the academic challenge is incredibly important, but so is the opportunity for students to actually demonstrate what they've learned. As a teacher, for me to see students actually speaking in and ruminating and thinking about and deliberating about primary sources and the Constitution and its modern application is really something that's almost undescribable. Everybody that comes into my room is just blown away. What is happening here? And how do I make it happen in other places? And so I think the deep dive breeds very high interest with students, and they want to be a part of it because they begin to understand what it takes to develop some expertise and excellence at something, which is something, unfortunately, they don't get the opportunity to do very much at the high school level. And the last thing I'll say is that the work that we're doing, the things we're doing, as Ian hinted at and as Chris hinted at, affects their everyday life. And so they begin to see why these things are important from just the foundational principles and the civic virtues, which I may talk about a little bit later, but then additionally, just seeing things through the We the People lens. I had a student come to me the other day and said, I was in forensics and I thought about Socrates. She said, I was thinking about saving for a car and doing something else. And I thought, how do I discern between my wants and my needs? And I thought, if we're getting students to think about that type of self-discipline and apply that to their lives, like that's one step in the right direction. So I absolutely love this program, and it's life-changing.
It was life-changing for me as a 17-year-old. I participated in the program the very first year it was offered on the bicentennial of the US Constitution. I was 17 then. And as an immigrant at that point, I had only been in the United States about 9-10 years. I felt like, okay, this is it. This is what I've been waiting my whole life for. Finally, it exists. And to this day, that version of the book, the first edition, is something that I keep very close to me. It's often on my bedstand. So thank you for that. Alicia Searcy, you are a former 6-term state legislator and statewide candidate who recently received more than 1.7 million votes in the state of Georgia. Would you talk about the general level of civics knowledge you saw in the state legislature, state government, and also among the general public?
Sure, and thank you for having me. I wish that I had the benefit of the We the People program when I was growing up, but I did have, excuse me, the benefit of a program called Kids Voting. I grew up in Florida and remember the voting machines, being set up in the same hallway that my parents would go and vote, and being able to participate in the process at 8, 9, and 10 years old really helped to plant those seeds of being engaged in our process. And I remember being in high school as well, and wanting to have a cultural heritage club at my high school. And my principal at the time was not very supportive. And so I went to the school board as a way to advocate for getting this club in our schools. And so I share those experiences because I know that part of my public education growing up, both in my school and in the community and organizations that I was involved in, really helped me to understand our government, right? Our founding documents, the promises of this country. And so it was certainly part of why I ran for office when I was 23, very young. People will say all the time, what were you doing at 23? I was running for the state legislature. And one of the reasons why I ran is because I wanted to get people involved in the process. I wanted people to understand how our government works, what the roles and responsibilities are, and how our involvement is necessary, right, to keep this thing going. And so when I got elected and started serving in the legislature, of course, my colleagues and people who worked in state government were very familiar with how government works, the responsibilities that we had. But I will tell you that the biggest disappointment were the people who voted for me. I love and appreciate the folks who voted for me and helped us to make history and all of those things. But I would often be in the grocery store and someone would say, oh, when do you go back to DC? Because they didn't realize that I was in the state legislature, not a member of the United States Congress. And I don't blame them. I blame our education system, that we are not teaching enough about our civic virtues and thinking about who we are as a country and what our responsibility is as a citizenry. And so it was disappointing and frustrating at times, but I also use that as an opportunity to teach
Mhm.
And so I would have every year at least 100 people from my district come to the Capitol to learn about the process so that you could understand what's the difference between the state legislature, local government, the things that I'm able to do, the things that the federal government does, and so on, because I believe that that's a part of understanding, again, who we are as a country, what our responsibilities are, and the work that yet is still to be done.
Thank you. Roger DeRoziers, you're a retired teacher and highly respected state and national leader in high school history and civics. I've had the pleasure to work with you on We the People, and I know that for myself. Could you talk about the general academic quality of K through 12 civics instruction and why, for decades, the subject often seems to have been shunted aside in favor of ELA, math, or science? I think you are muted, Roger. Left-hand corner.
It often is the case. Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss a really vital matter that is that we need to address in our country today. The reasoning behind all of this, I think, is quite historical. I mean, given the fact that our founders established a government upon which one of the necessities they all claimed was that in order for our government to succeed, the citizenry needed to be informed. And yet that has not been done very, very well. Horace Mann in the 19th century established public schools where the primary mission was going to be assuring, that citizens, would be created and they would understand, their role and how civics, would be the primary mission of public education. And here we are, 20th century, 21st century, and essentially what has happened is we have basically lost that mission. And starting off, in my opinion, the primary culprit, if you will, began probably with the launching of Sputnik in 1957.
Mhm.
And that was at that particular time, where an unintended consequence occurred that essentially caused the government to say, well, we need to focus more greatly on math and science because we look like we're behind. And the unintended consequence was the humanities, were going to suffer. So individual courses like geography, civics, even penmanship, were taken out of curriculum and established, were simply history courses. In particular, civics was given, was going to be lumped in, if you will, with history.
So I will go to our next panelist, Emily Voss. Emily, you have worked in civic education at James Madison's Montpelier. I saw you there recently as Virginia's state We the People coordinator, and now for We the People nationally. Virginia is consistently among the best states in the country on We the People. Would you talk about the school, state, and overall supports Virginia provides to create such a successful, robust state civics program?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. So I think I'll answer the question in a couple of different ways. Firstly, advocating for good civics education in any state is really a team effort. The We the People program in Virginia is sponsored by a nonprofit called Virginia Civics. But Virginia Civics is part of a statewide coalition of civically minded organizations that have been working together since 2020 to strengthen civics education in the Commonwealth. And that includes folks in the K-12 space, museum educators, service organizations, universities, among others. So, really keeping civics top of mind is a team effort. Now, with regards to the We the People competition and Virginia's success there, the success there is attributable to a combination of factors. We certainly do have amazing, dedicated educators who are passionate in their own right about civic education. They are also passionate about the We the People curriculum, and they know that it engages students at a very deep level with the subject matter, and they really stand up for the curriculum in their own schools. And then, of course, they are supported by the Virginia Civics organization. So that creates kind of a strong little team right there. And I'll further shout out our amazing educators in Virginia that many of them have also been extremely generous with their own time and their willingness to mentor other teachers. So We the People becomes, not just a competition, but there's also this amazing spirit of camaraderie, which has helped to build the program year over year. And, the teachers enjoy competing with each other, but they are more interested in the growth of the program as a whole, because they recognize that the more schools that there are participating, then the more that they'll ultimately kind of push each other to get better at competition. So those are my two thoughts there.
Thank you, Emily. Okay. Back to Kelly Brown. In Massachusetts, your leadership as a classroom teacher has propelled your students to higher academic achievements. Would you share with us what students like about We the People's content-focused approach, as well as how the wider community of social studies teachers in your school and district view the idea of civics and history instruction being grounded in primary sources, as you mentioned, including the founding documents, the Federalist Papers, and the major civic events in U.S. history?
Sure. So I think my students enjoy a lot of things about the We the People program. I think they enjoy the very high expectations. I think they enjoy the content-focused approach, but it's one that requires sort of evidence-based reasoning and analysis that they really enjoy getting into. And I think if you're doing that type of inquiry, research certainly shows, and my own anecdotal experience shows, that you really do have to have a deep content understanding of things before you can actually engage in authentic inquiry work. And so I think they like that. I think they like the excitement and the pressure, and they like to see themselves grow. This is a course where they can actually literally watch themselves grow and learn. And it's about something that is incredibly important to us. And so, for example, the last 2 weeks we're going through the Constitution line by line, and they come in every single day and they're like, we're never going to finish this. We're going to be doing this for an entire semester, because it's really important for them to understand every word that is in there, and they're working on really memorizing a lot of that. And someone might say, well, what's the value of the rote memorization of these things? Well, it's really important, because if you're going to analyze and apply things, you really do have to know them, and you have to be able to look at the words for yourself and not just hear what your teacher has to say about them. And my course is very primary source based, and my history teaching in general is, and I do think that most of the history teachers I work with and train and work with are trying to emphasize primary sources. The very first day of class, when I bring my students in, we do a lesson on what the pursuit of happiness means. And we talk about this concept of happiness being equated with living a virtuous life. And we look at 4 primary sources on that very first day of class. No syllabus for me, right? I say that what this class is about is helping you think about what is going to help you lead a happy life. Let's see what Epicurus has to say about that. Let's see what Cicero said about that, Aristotle, John Locke, John Adams and Thoughts on Government, right? This thing that Ian is talking about, and that everyone has been talking about here, of placing virtue at the center and having students engage with that. Like, what do you think about, I have 12 civic behaviors on my wall. What do you think about the idea that these might help you lead a happier life? And so from day one, I'm trying to say to students, like, this is something that is bigger than you. And I think they enjoy that. They love the competition. It's exciting. It's something for them to work towards. My students love We the People so much as they come back every year to coach this year's students. And I always joke it's because they love talking about this stuff so much, but nobody else wants to talk to them about it. So they come back to talk to my students about it. But it's that feeling of, I think in a newspaper once, one of my students said, I've never had a class in which my community cares so much about how I'm doing. And I think there's something to that with We the People, that and by looking at those documents, right? Like this isn't about me telling them something. It's about me opening up a window into a long history of things and looking at the past and discovering how the past may connect to the present and allowing them to think about what that looks like. It's so fun to be that kind of shepherd.
Yeah, they really honoring their own thinking, their own development and engagement with the text. And of course that textual analysis, the attention to detail that it develops in people, and the fact that, you know, language is important is something they can carry in every kind of learning, every kind of subject. Alicia, those who read about the inhumanity and civil rights abuses in Bull Connor's Birmingham, Alabama, or Senator James O. Eastland's Mississippi are left wondering what terms like rights and justice meant in America before the civil rights era of the 1960s. As a former elected official in the South, how well do you understand the lessons, or how well do you think we all understand the lessons from that era today?
I see I've gotten all the easy questions. So you mentioned names like Bull Connor and Eastland from Mississippi, and you think about arguably two of the most racist, two of the most known white supremacist segregationists in our history, right? And two of these individuals, you know, have literally blocked, literally and figuratively in terms of the legislative process, blocked some of the most significant pieces of policy, whether we're talking about, you know, civil and voting rights, or whether we're talking about anti-lynching laws. And so these are people who really stood in the way of the ideals in our country, right? So when we talk about what it means to protect the liberties and the freedoms of all people in this country, I think they were probably the examples of what that didn't mean. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when our founding documents were created and signed, not everyone was included, right? Not everyone was considered in a part of that in that time. And so we also have to acknowledge that some of the most significant injustices that have happened in this country, right, have happened before 1960. You asked specifically about 1960. So whether it's, you know, against African Americans or Native Americans with Jim Crow, all of the fights around civil and human rights, and we know that work continues. And so what are the lessons that we've learned? I would like to believe that at least socially and politically, that those behaviors are unacceptable. I would like to believe that everyone, the vast majority of Americans, particularly elected officials, who are responsible for creating a government, right, that is inclusive of all people, and that they're not using their positions of power and influence to block the rights and liberties of other people, regardless of the color of their skin or any other identifier. And so certainly we've come a long way, right, where we don't have the Bull Connors and the Eastlands in the U.S. Senate or, you know, as public safety directors. And we're proud of that. We're proud of the wrongs that have been made right. But we also have to acknowledge that there is more work to do, right? When you think of the George Floyds of the world, and those kinds of situations happen sadly way too often in this country, that we learn that all of us need to be included. We learn that government can be used to help people as a safety net, as a way to protect the rights and freedoms of all people. And so I think we're continuing to learn that lesson as we continue to perfect this union.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Roger DeRoziers, you've made many public presentations on constitutionalism, liberalism, and republicanism, which provide some of the basics of American civics. Would you quickly share your experiences weaving together the key civic lessons from the founding documents when teaching the subject to the general public?
That's referencing the fact that I do a lot of adult learning. Part of the reason that I do that is because of the times that we're living in, which demonstrates that for the past 3 generations, we've not emphasized, enough civic education. And so my feeling is that we need to address the fact that we have a lot of people that simply do not know very much about what their government is all about, why it was created, what are the principles of government, despite the fact that these words are often stated through the media by various political leaders. And yet, for the most part, they don't know what these terms mean. So constitutionalism may be a term they hear, but they have no idea what that word means, nor does the term liberalism, other than perhaps the term liberal being associated, with a particular group of people versus conservatives. The term republicanism most likely is going to be addressed, to a political party as opposed, to the terminology, that is addressed, by our founders. So the importance of recognizing important vocabulary and principles of government and values has, for all practical purposes, not been addressed, by people. And understood by people. So when I speak to people, first and foremost, the ones who are coming are people who are thirsty for understanding about their government. So it's not the vast majority, unfortunately, but those who are thirsty want to know what's going on. And invariably, the vast majority, once they hear about what the founders were trying to accomplish and the type of government that they were trying to establish, are dumbfounded. They didn't even realize it. They had no clue. They had no understanding. And so they realize the fact that that this was what they were trying to accomplish, and they understand the word compromise in a whole different light. They understand, words that are used that today have a pejorative meaning. They all of a sudden understand these weren't meant to be pejorative. They were meant to be, workable words and terms that were going to allow for this government to work. And it's like, these people need to understand this. These are adults, these are citizens, these are people who go to vote and don't understand what's happening. So we need more adult learning. Unfortunately, our media does not do anything about informing people. They do more, to just simply reflect what is there. And unfortunately, the media is there to making sure that people come back to listen to more about what they need to say rather than informing. And it's unfortunate. So
Yeah.
I believe we need to do more to address our adult population. Not everybody, unfortunately, is interested. I just did a talk this year recently, and the bottom line is they were shocked to find out that our founders and our framers knew and were so as equally concerned about human nature then as we are today. And it was like, are you kidding? They knew this? They were afraid about people, who were going to be greedy. They were afraid about people who wanted power, and all of the quotations that I could use, and when I quoted from Washington's farewell address about the fear of political parties, they were astounded. And it was like, we lack so much knowledge out there that no wonder they're making so many difficult choices, or not making choices that they need to be making, that would make our democracy and republic work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost you almost want to just wave a wand and have civics just come into every part of the education system as a way to solve our really, contemporary problems. It's that potent, and yet we're lacking it. 90%, Emily, 90% of the funding and governance of the public education occur at the state, local, and school levels. Could you please talk about how Virginia and We the People has stayed on mission while navigating various other often politically charged national efforts like Common Core or the 1619 Project?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that both Virginia Civics and the Center for Civic Education, who crafts the We the People curriculum, they have maintained their commitment to both We the People and other programs that they offer by staying focused on the core mission, which is providing high quality civic and constitutional education for everyone as a means for a responsible and sustainable society. So that's a pretty big and broad mission. And then, how we do this specifically through programs like We the People is specifically looking to improve students' knowledge, skills, and dispositions around civics and government. So when we're talking about knowledge, this is, improving students' understanding of the institutions of constitutional democracy, fundamental principles, and the values that we've spoken about up to this point in this conversation. When we talk about skills, we're talking about skills necessary to participate as responsible citizens. And then the disposition is the willingness to use democratic procedures for making decisions and managing conflict. So although there have been a lot of initiatives that have come, and some of them that have been very polarizing, the curriculum's focus has really stayed the same. And the curriculum has been updated a number of times since its inception in the early 1980s. But those updates have never been driven by a specific national initiative. Mm-hmm. So by sticking to the knowledge, skills, and dispositions, that has really allowed the curriculum to enjoy, frankly, an unusual amount of bipartisan support over the past 40 years. And that has allowed us to, when appropriate, align with broader educational objectives. Mm-hmm. So, for example, at the moment, the C3 framework, the Educating for American Democracy initiative, we can create crosswalks that say, here's how our curriculum meets these particular educational goals, but we're not allowing those initiatives to drive our decision-making about what's in the curriculum itself. So, really staying true to our mission and our goals for the curriculum has helped quite a lot.
Fantastic, fantastic. Kelly Brown, during the 20th century, there was an enormous loss of life due to totalitarian regimes and dictatorships, including Stalin's Soviet Union, Hitler's Germany, Mao's China, and Pol Pot's Cambodia, to name just a few. How should teachers use these civic anti-models to help students appreciate the importance of ordered liberty in our democracy?
So this is a fantastic question. And my first response to this was, I should do this more. But I do have some thoughts about this because I think it's really incredibly important. I think first, just Miriam, you were making mention earlier of like the choice of words and the concept of ordered liberty, right? It sounds almost oxymoronic in its essence, but I've come to believe that it's this like careful balance between these two things that makes our system so brilliant. It's an interesting term that we look at a lot because it also has legal meaning in our constitutional history as well. It's not absolute liberty, but liberty, you can't have actual constitutional government with higher law without liberty. And so this is central. And I think it's amazing to think about the fact that our founders were incredibly skeptical about human nature, but they were also trusting enough in humans to be able to govern themselves. And so one of the things that I'm going to get to this question, but I think the way in which we look at this in my own classroom is we look at sort of the thinking and discussion about ancient, for example, constitutions. So looking at something like Plato's Republic and looking at what Plato sort of proposes as problems with the cycles of government. So, aristocracy being a natural form, which gets replaced by an oligarchy. Oligarchy sort of gets overthrown by democracy, which in its inability to discern between wants and needs and engage in licentiousness ends up in anarchy, which then lets people sort of crave tyranny. And so all that to be said, that starting very early on in my class, looking at this, right, looking at the fact that tyranny is something that can come from many directions and can come very unexpectedly to people, and helping students understand that, I think, to start. It may not be a perfect model, but it's a model for discussion, because it shows us that, all forms of government potentially turn to corruption, right? A lot of the ancient discussions about models of government show us that checks and balances and limited government are something that have had a long place in discussion in constitutional governments. Moral and virtuous education is absolutely essential to what's happening, and concerns about human nature have permeated. So setting that groundwork, one example that you mentioned, something that I actually have taught about for the last 20 years, is particularly Cambodia. Which has a special connection in my own community because we have a large number of families who actually came from Cambodia. When I first started teaching, many of my Cambodian students actually had been born in refugee camps. And so they were actually a part of what had happened. And so for me, it was very important to learn that history and also to have that history be part of our community. But I think that part of what we do when we look at that is also, I think, help students understand how fragile constitutions can be, and that there's a real problem with looking at things as something that happens to other people, because Cambodians didn't expect to have happen what happened with the Khmer Rouge. They didn't expect this to come, and tyranny didn't come from Pol Pot. It came from the development of communism, right? And the communist movement amongst the people. And so I think there are just so many lessons that we can look at and see these elements that stream through. I don't want to engage in false comparisons with students, but I also want to give them some context and grounding to understand the complexity, as tyranny isn't something that happens to other people. Right?
Mhm.
Tyranny potentially can happen to anyone, and that fragility, right, was very, very clear
Yeah.
to the founding generation, and it should be clear to us.
Right.
And that to me is a real fear, and why I think looking at these kind of anti-models and
Right.
looking at the way that they develop is so incredibly important when we talk about why it's so important for everyone to be a part of preserving our Constitution and preserving a constitutional government. So I know that's a little bit of a roundabout way to answer that, but I think that's the most authentic way I can say that I would engage with it.
Right. Yeah. I think that something I've noticed is that, and maybe this is not related to the education system, maybe it's related more to media, but people have a tendency, I think, to think, okay, when a country is so tyrannical that it's everyone in that society is tyrannical, but not necessarily so. I mean, freedom can go quickly, it can slide away, and yet there are people in that society that were really fundamental to creating some liberties, and they still exist. So it's not a monolith.
Exactly.
Yeah. Alicia, Ian talked about the need for better understanding of civic virtue in our country. Would you share with us some of your heroes and heroines from U.S. history, and what students and the public need to know about how learning from great historical figures can make us better as citizens?
Sure. First of all, I want to take Miss Brown's class. So do
I
you take
know.
adult learners?
I actually do.
Same here.
I want to audit the class and just learning again, we're not learning all of this in school, right? And so unless you have a Miss Brown or a Miss Voss, you may not have the opportunity to learn and to really think about the philosophies of our founding fathers, right? And think about in comparing other countries. I thought about, travels to South Africa in the early 2000s and how their constitution at the time was so very new, right? It had just been written in 1995. And so just how, all of these democracies are evolving, right? And hopefully ever changing. And so to answer your question, I thought about two people that have been influential to me and I consider to be heroes. One is FDR, who has a connection to Georgia. As we all know, he was the last president to serve 3 terms, excuse me, and served at a really crucial time in our country, right? And this is a president who grew up wealthy, but because of his time that he spent in Georgia, and learning about the plights of working people or not working people, right? He during his time, created things like labor laws and the Social Security Administration, the Food and Drug Administration, the GI Bill, because he understood what government could do as a safety net for people in our country who needed us to come together, particularly at that time. He has a quote that I love from 1938 that says, "Democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. The real safeguard of democracy, therefore, is education." So he also understood what needed to happen in classrooms across the country to help us preserve this democracy. So I consider him to be one of our heroes. Another heroine that I would bring to this conversation is Barbara Jordan, who was the first African-American member of Congress elected from the South after Reconstruction. And she had a lot of firsts in her history, but one that she's known for, of course, is during the time of the Nixon impeachment hearings. And she has a very powerful quote that says, "My faith in the Constitution is whole, it is complete, it is total. And I am not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution." So again, here is a woman that when our Constitution was written, didn't necessarily have her in mind. And she acknowledges that during her speech during this time. But as a member of Congress, as an American, she believes so deeply in our Constitution, in our ideals. And so I think these are two people who have made significant strides in American history, who I think are influential and help us to remember who we are as a nation, what our founding fathers were after, and that whether we were included at that time or not, all of us should subscribe to these ideals of freedom and justice and equality and moderation. And so those are the folks that I would say. And I think what our young people can learn from this is, again, no matter what your background is, as an American, you too should believe in the Constitution, that we should hold our country responsible for the things that we say we believe in, that our laws, that our process should be a reflection of that, and that there are people from all walks of life who have helped, again, to help perfect this nation. And the work is not done, but you can be an FDR, you can be a Barbara Jordan to help, again, take this country to where it needs to be.
Right. Roger, as a military veteran, what are the civics lessons about America's constitutional powers for declaring wars or war making that you think young people need to better understand today?
Well, that's a difficult issue simply because we've been in over 200 different episodes, if you will, around the world, and only 5 times have we declared war in the manner in which our Constitution, okay, requires. But we have, from teaching students, we would need to indicate to them that the Congress, in many ways, has abdicated its role in allowing, if you will, the use of our military in order to protect and preserve our nation. It has not followed the recourse, okay, in which the founders wrote the Constitution. However, having said that, the rationale for that has been essentially because of the intense fallback that would have occurred, especially in the wars since World War II, the Korean invasion, the Vietnam, and some of the other wars, if you will, in Iraq and Afghanistan, etc. The bottom line is the Congress has essentially abdicated its role. However, it has followed its other role, which is providing appropriations. And appropriations is the role of Congress. And if it does appropriate in spending for these wars, it does indeed support the war efforts. So in that particular case, one can talk about the fact that the spending powers of the Congress are being utilized in order to provide for the war. So one can turn around and say that the legal, if one wants to use the terminology of declaring war, has not been exercised properly. One can then turn around and say that the Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution has been used from the purpose of the funding for the war has been granted through Congress, thus allowing for the military to do, okay, what President has given as Commander-in-Chief to the military to exercise.
Thank you so much. Emily, the 2022 NAEP results revealed that the COVID pandemic learning loss is large and likely generation changing. What should people in the civic education community and state leaders do to ensure that basic civics is central to efforts to remediate learning loss?
Yeah, absolutely. So the impact of COVID-19 on learning loss is certainly significant. So within the civic education community, and also along with state leaders, they should consider potentially several key actions. First among them is prioritizing civic education. So civic education, as we have all discussed here, is an essential part of every curriculum, and they should be ensuring that it receives the attention and resources that it deserves. So that's primary thing number one. I would also encourage folks to consider an integrated approach, which is to say that civics does not need to sit in its own individual class, that civics can in fact be incorporated into multiple subject areas, so that it could easily connect with science, with math. A lot of other subjects have the opportunity to have civics incorporated. So that could be a huge benefit. We're also really encouraging folks to consider community engagement and crafting partnerships where possible between schools and local government and other community organizations. And so this can help provide some real world learning experiences and opportunities for students to apply the knowledge that they're gaining in a classroom setting. So that's I think an innovative approach that some schools are doing really well. And then last thing is teacher training, investing in teacher training and professional development to help our educators is so important. So the learning loss, I mean, among students is certainly an issue, and the teachers are navigating that on a day-to-day basis. So whatever we can do to support teachers in their endeavors, we absolutely should do.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Kelly, some parents, teachers, and policymakers across the country are concerned that schools might be using civics and social studies classes to advocate for partisan political agendas, steering students towards political activism before they have the basic knowledge to fully understand their emerging roles as citizens. How do you address these wider issues or thorny current events with your students and classes? And are these national news events helpful or a distraction in teaching students history and civics?
It's a great question. So there's like a quote that's often attributed to Aristotle, which actually he didn't say, but he kind of did get at the essence of it, where he says something to the effect of, it's a mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain an idea without adopting it or without accepting it. One of the first things I say to my students when they walk in the room is that it's really important for us, as we develop skills around civil discourse, to be able to look at people with whom we disagree as people with whom we disagree. And in our current, I think, political climate, that becomes really difficult because people tend to dehumanize people they disagree with. Emotion tends to overtake reason. And so one of the things that I work from the very beginning in my class really is to have students understand that they don't have to put passion before reason. Doesn't mean they can't be passionate about something, but it is important to have your passion based in reason. And so helping students, and then also really living that for them, being able to help them see multiple sides to different issues. I also think it's really helpful for them to understand, and I mentioned this before, and Chris mentioned in his opening remarks that we shouldn't ignore history, that it's actually somewhat relieving to have students see the fact that things like human nature, corruption, these issues that seem so relevant in our face right now are issues that people have been talking about throughout history, right? This is not something that is new and unique to us. This is something that is actually part of the long story of self-government. And so in a way, I know that sounds sort of backwards, but it is somewhat settling for students to say, oh, Thucydides wrote about the fact that, Corsair was crushed by factions, and that Cicero wrote about the fact that when you live by vice, you become overly anxious and you stir in emotions, right? What teenager can't connect to those ideas? And so I think for me, sure, it's thorny, right? I also think we've had so many unique constitutional situations in the last 10 years that it's kind of been the civics teacher's gift that keeps on giving, because I've looked at parts of the Constitution that I've never looked at before with my students because of all the things that have been happening. And so I just really think it can be tricky, but I also find that my students are way better at dealing with these passionate things in the media once they've had my class. So, when something comes along, they have better tools to actually sort through the thorniness and look for truth and look for reason, as opposed to just jumping into passion. And I think for me, if I can just help students do that, nothing else matters.
Okay, excellent. We've had some excellent answers, and so we're running short on time. I think I'm going to skip to the end here and ask one question to the entire panel, and maybe we can go backwards. Our panelist Emily Voss had to leave us, unfortunately. So we'll begin with Roger, go to Alicia, and then Kelly. This joint question for all of you is, if you had to pick one feature of the founding documents, a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision or key speech from U.S. history to persuade students to want to learn more about American civics and constitutionalism, what would it be, and how would you engage them on the topic?
Well, there is so much, okay, that one would
Maybe just 1 minute, maybe just 1 minute on these answers.
make. So the bottom line is I wanted to take something appropriate to the times. And so I would have them read the Declaration of Conscience by Margaret Chase Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Fact is, okay, when she was so concerned, okay, about how the Republican Party, her party, was not responding in the way that she was concerned with regard to Joseph McCarthy's attacks, and without any kind of support and any true evidence, she couldn't take it, and she simply, okay, wrote this Declaration of Conscience, basically saying we can't have, okay, people making statements that are contradicting and taking away the right to criticize, the right to hold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, the right of independent thought. And she criticized, okay, her party and her leaders. And I just thought, given the times that we're living in and what's been going on, okay, currently, it's a document that I think would resonate, okay, well, I think, for students to look at.
Thank you. And Alicia?
So my favorite is not a speech, but a letter. Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail.
Yes.
I think it's one of the most powerful pieces of, I don't even know if you want to call it literature, but just writings that speak to our responsibility. At the time, you know, there were ministers in Birmingham who were frustrated that he was there. And, you know, wondered if he lived in Atlanta, why are you in Alabama? And so he helped us to understand that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so I would encourage students to read that letter, to think about their own responsibilities, right? To, you know, be the brother and the sister's keeper. Believe again in the ideals of our Constitution and other founding documents. We have a responsibility as Americans to make sure that everyone feels included and has access to those rights and liberties.
And another sentence from Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which I love. We translated that to Persian and disseminated it to people living in Iran. And my favorite sentence from that is beware the moderate. People who stand in the middle and make it seem like they're really reasonable people and they're just interested in the common good, but really they're just not taking a stand. So there's a difference between having a strong political center and avoiding factionalization and avoiding useless fights and choosing to stand on principle. And I love Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, especially for that. And finally, Kelly Brown.
So I'll be the traditionalist here, and I'll just take two quotes from two Federalist papers that I think are relevant for the time. One is from Federalist 1, when Hamilton says we're at this important moment to determine whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident or force. And I think there's some thought about personal responsibility and government there, and how do we do that. And the other one that I love, which connects to some of the things we talked about earlier, where tyrants may come from another place, is Federalist 55, where Madison says something to the effect of, even if every Athenian were a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would have been a mob. And I think really thinking about how important it is to check our own behavior and to operate both in our own lives under self-control, but also see a responsibility to recognize in ourselves the need for checks and balances and control and reason, and to humility maybe is a way to end. I think that's important. So thank you for having us all.
Thank you. It's such an honor. I took so many notes throughout this discussion, and I want to thank you for for your time, but more importantly, everything that you do in your career to make our country a better place and really to be an inspiration for other countries in the world. Jamie Gass.
I'm really grateful to Chris and Ian and you, Miriam, and all of our panelists who did a fantastic job, really helped to bring to life the kind of ideals and the kind of principles that we really tried to encompass in the book. So with that, again, I want to thank everyone. Here's the book. It's on Amazon. You can find more information on the Pioneer website about that, which is pioneerinstitute.org. And thank you so much.